In this lesson, which is also our final lesson, except the bonus lessons that will follow on this training also, of course. And in our final lesson, we will create a walk cycle, but not really a complete one, because that is really difficult and challenging, and it would take significant amount of time, and it's practically impossible to record in a non-confusing manner. But no worries, this lesson will probably be much more than you expected, because I will actually show you everything you need to know to be able to create a successful walk cycle. Now, animation also has, let's say, 12 basic principles, but I really don't want to bug you with that, since it is all theory and you can find that online. What is important and relevant to us is that animating characters, such as this one, can be done in two ways. The first way is called straight ahead and includes creating keyframes in linear fashion for every single frame. So you would simply move the foot a little bit, add a keyframe, move the foot a little bit more, add a keyframe, and build a complete walk cycle in that fashion. And that method is preferred by some animators and not by me, because I find the second method, which is called pose to pose, to be much more easier and takes a huge amount of work off your back when you are utilizing that method. So we will use pose to pose method, and we already use that method. So pose to pose is simply a method where you create main poses in terms of keyframe, and everything else is interpolated, just as our object in first lesson in our animation crash course. So main poses are created and everything else is calculated by Cinema 4D. Now, I strongly suggest, if you want to be able to create walk cycles, patience is absolutely crucial, and to produce something that is good enough will probably take considerable amount of time. That is simply how it is, and there is no way around it. Now, when using pose-to-pose methods of animation, a walk cycle can be broken down into 5 main poses, which are contact pose, when both legs are on the ground and the spread between the legs is the widest, and let's actually do that. It will help us visualize some things. Let me select my doodle tool. Now, the contact pose is, let's just concentrate on the legs, and something like this. This would be the contact pose, where the spread is the largest and both feet are touching the ground. The second pose, and I will just clear this little frame and explain the next pose, and the next pose is called down pose or recoil pose. That basically means that the character is roughly something like this, and the position of the pelvis or a complete body, the height of the character is at its lowest position. That's why it's called down pose or recoil pose, because it reached the maximum downright position. I really hope I pronounced that correctly and that you're understanding what I'm saying. So that's the recoil pose. Let's clear this doodle frame and go to our third pose, and this third pose is called passing pose, and it's called passing because in that situation the arms are most probably along the character, so something like this. So character is in sort of a passing state, so it's not in any particular pose, it's simply passing, and I really hope that makes sense. Also, it is in higher position as opposed to a recoil pose. So this would be the recoil pose and this would be the passing pose, because the character really pushed itself while it was walking a little bit higher. I really hope you are still following, and we will help ourselves with markers, and I will build the markers once we enter the animation layout, and let's really continue with our poses. So the third pose is actually delete this frame, and if I said third, disregard that, because actually this is the fourth pose, is called high point or up pose, and in that pose the character is really, let's say, in its highest position, so something like this, and I'm really drawing and talking, which is not really good, and it gives results like this, but I really hope you're able to see. So in this position the character is in its most upright position, and even higher than this passing pose. Just quickly write it. So this is why it is called the high point or up pose. Clear that one too. And the last pose, the fifth one, is once again the contact pose. But of course, if you have a left leg and right leg like this, so right, left in first position, then the contact pose is completely the same, but the legs position are inverted. So left comes here, right comes here, so nothing fancy. So let's repeat that once again. So contact pose, vertical or down, passing pose, high point or up pose, and contact once again. So effectively, if you build one contact pose, one recoil pose, one passing pose, one high point, and contact once again, you can have one stride. Okay? And if you combine this with another stride, like this, then you have a walk cycle. So once again, here would be a recoil pose, passing pose, high point, and once again contact pose, and this all will simply give you a walk cycle. Okay, so I really hope this makes sense, because you have to break down that animation into logical pieces with which you can actually work with, because otherwise, if you're not super capable and experienced, then the result will probably be too many keys, confusion, and a lot of frustration. Now, because things can get unbelievably complex and animation requires a lot of concentration, I will build just this one guy, this one stride in this lesson, and I will go to maximum detail to a point which it really makes sense, and where going further would simply unnecessarily confuse you. So now, since I'm not working at Pixar, I will help myself by going into animation menu like this, and maybe scaling this just a little bit, so I have more real estate here. I can get rid of this little guy, and I will create markers, but I also have to know in which time, in how many frames, that complete walk cycle will happen. Now, just to ease up this process and use a number which is a little bit high, but will be easier to work with and for you to follow, let's say that I want a walk cycle of 40 frames. And if you remember, in previous lessons we have 30 frames for a walk cycle, so this would be a little bit slower walk, but that's not really important at this moment. Now, if I will create just one stride, so this chunk here, that is half, then my stride would be 20 frames in length. Now, if I have 20 frames, let's actually delete this guy, so I can divide that 20 frames of duration to my 5 main poses. So 0 would be contact, on 5 I would have recoil, 10 means passing, 15 is a high point, and 20 is once again a contact pose. So let's help ourselves and create markers for each of those frames. So first marker at 0, we will select it and rename it contact, which would suggest contact pose. So this can really help you break down the motion, and I really urge you to use everything you can in Cine 4D to make your life easier. Okay, so let's go to frame 5. Let's create another marker. We will select it. We will rename it recoil. Then to frame 10, another marker. Select it. This will be called passing. Frame 15, another marker. Select it. This will be called high point. And finally, new marker here will be once again contact pose. So contact like this, and this can help us a great deal because we will have each of these guys instructing us what should happen at specific frame. Now, in each of these 5 markers, I will add notes with main features of specific pose, so I can really utilize this also. So this will also guide me. So let me just do a small pause and I will write specifics for each of these guys and we will continue. And here we are continuing, and notice that for each of these guys I created a few of these reminders. So for contact pose, that means legs are at maximum spread, both feet on the ground, and same goes for each and every of these pose, which will help us in process of creating this walk cycle. So let's actually start. Let me unhide all the necessary elements, and maybe I will just even make a little bit more screen real estate, and let's first define the elements we will use. We will most certainly use the legs, so let's select both of the legs guys and let's drop them here, and we will use arms also. So I'm selecting both of the arms controllers, and we will also use this root controller because it will be responsible for shifting the position of the character up and down for each of these poses. So something like this, you can do that, and let's drop it here also. And the best idea always, at least in my opinion, is to create both contact poses. Let me select this guy, and notice that when I select this guy here, the same controller is not selected in the object manager. Well, you can actually change that. So here under view, link, you have a link TL/OM selection, which means link timeline with object manager selection. So if I enable that, whenever I select something here, for example, left leg, it will be also selected in object manager, and I really find that useful. Let's go with our first marker, and it says legs are at maximum spread and both feet are on the ground. So let's start with the left leg backwards. So let me drag it by maybe 30 or so, and there are no right values. You simply have to use your artistic sense here, and let's go with the right leg, and let's use the same value, so something like this. And now I really want to keep things clean and neat, so I will add keyframes here, and it is also important to freeze all transformations so you can work with the clean values. So imagine that I have some crazy number here. It would be really difficult to read out that I actually moved the controller for 30 units or centimeters in this case. So let's add a keyframe like this. Also for the left leg like this, and we can scrub the time and simply do the same but the opposite for this contact pose. So the legs position should be inverted. So let's select this left leg to go 60 centimeters like this, and You can tell that the value is correct because the legs are matching. Add a keyframe, select the right leg, and simply pull it by 60 centimeters back. So basically now you're having a really simple motion of the legs, and this is the start. This is how you build a walk cycle. You do a basic motion and then you layer the motion and then you refine, and refine. Now if you take a look closer at these legs, you would expect this leg to be pointing really like this. So use your logic here. There is nothing unusual about this, and this leg should probably be a little bit more like this, relatively speaking, but use your artistic sense. Observe the motion in the nature. So let's select the left leg, and under foot controls I'll have controls to control that ball or heel lift. Let me select it once again. So I'm searching for the right value, so maybe something like 50, and it really doesn't have to be a round number. Anything you find to be working for you. So whatever is appealing to you should be the right value, and try to remain objective. And for the purpose of this lesson I will use round values if possible. So let me keyframe that like this, and for this right leg we'll probably have to move this heel lift, maybe even, let's say 75. Let's add a keyframe, and we will not worry about this little gap at this moment. And this is my basic pose for this contact pose. Now let's go to this contact pose and simply change the value. So for the right leg, this should be a different value. So this should be 0, like this, and this value should be 50, if you recall correctly from this leg. So keyframe that also. And for the left leg, this should be 0, and this heel lift should be 75, just as in this first initial contact pose. Let's add a keyframe, and for this ball lift also. And ones among you that are following closely probably noticed that I made a mistake. So watch what happens if I go back to my first contact pose. This is not what you would expect. So I did not keyframe the values I changed later for this contact pose. So be aware of that. This can become really complicated in minimal amount of time. So search once again for the proper value. So this should be 0 in this case. So keyframe that like this. And for the right leg, this value, if I'm not mistaken, should be 0. So keyframe that. And just to explain briefly what happened here, I changed the value for each leg on this contact pose, but I haven't instructed Cine 4D that on this contact pose that value should stay 0. So immediately once you hit play, it will start the interpolation. Okay, I hope that makes sense, because I don't know how to explain this in other manner. So if you want a value to stay at certain value, you naturally have to keyframe it. And if you don't have a keyframe here, it will take this value, which is keyframed. I really hope that makes sense. Now let's go to our next pose, which is a recall pose, and this is a perfect time to demonstrate it, to illustrate the problem I was having. So now my timeline marker is extracting me that this is the most downward position, but if I select my controller and move it downward, this value will now be the same for all poses, because I haven't added a keyframe for that root or pelvis controller. at this contact pose. So you have to be aware of everything. So that is why animation is really difficult. So now in this pose, even though you cannot really logically conclude that you need a keyframe now, you actually need one. So here under coordinates, under Y, I will keyframe this value to be 0. So this will be default value for my root controller. And in this position, we'll simply have to decide, based on a certain criteria or artistic sense, how much should this character go down. And if you remember from our C motion lessons, these values can be really low, so 1, 2, or 3. And the more you add in terms of units here, the character will appear to have more weight, so it will have a sense of larger weight, and achieving those intricate appearances of the characters is probably by far the hardest thing to do in animation. So let me just stop talking and pull this female character a little bit down, maybe let's say 3 centimeters, and let's see how that works. So now nothing will happen because I haven't added a keyframe, so let's do just that. Let's see what happens. So it goes down. Now let's see what else it says under marker. It says most downward position, okay. Legs are spread less than in a contact pose, and that is done by default. Now always use your sense of logic. So this cannot happen. This foot has to be on the ground. So whenever something is obvious, simply do it. So let's find our foot controls and see which one of these guys I have to adjust. So this foot is on the ground, and well, we can use 10 here. So let's keyframe 10 like this, and also at this moment we will be using our artistic sense, so try to deconstruct that motion. So now in my mind this leg should really lift from the ground, if you understand what I mean. So it should go upward, because otherwise our character will simply appear to be sliding or not lifting its foot from the ground. So in that sense, if the foot is beginning to lift, then in this passing pose, let's just see, the foot should be higher in its maximum position, and also the legs should be in line, and one is on the ground while other is passing. And you can think of this as the middle of the box. So instead of adding a keyframe here for this foot, I'll actually add it here at the passing pose. And of course I want to add a default height for that foot, otherwise it will always be at that maximum position. So we have to keyframe from 0 to some arbitrary value. So let's select left leg, and under coordinates, let's add a keyframe for position Y, like this. And let's say that here, at the passing pose, we'll simply use maybe, let's say, 10. Maybe this is too much, but just for the sake of demonstration, like this. So I added a maximum value at the passing pose, and also at this contact pose it should be 0, because it says here the both feet are on the ground. So you can obviously see how this can become really complicated and a lot of things to be aware of. And trust me, it is much more difficult when you are recording this. So let's see, what do we have? So something like this. And notice this arc. This arc is a secret to a natural motion, because everything in nature, in biological creatures, and probably in all motions except mechanical ones, behaves like this. So it is either an arc movement or a movement through a sine wave. So essentially, you're just layering your animation. So now let's take a look at this high point. So it says it has to be in the highest position higher than contact position. So let's see what position is it, and it is in -3. So let's go maybe to 2 or something like that. We will add a keyframe. Let's see how that works. So in our contact pose, it should be 0. It should go down in our recoil pose. It should go upwards just a little bit in a passing pose until it reaches the highest point here. So maybe we could even go with 3. So just to emphasize things. So take a look at this. So character appears to have weight and it's lifting. And following some common sense, this foot should stay flat. Let me just doodle that quickly. So it should stay flat through this range. Okay, something like this. And when I say range, I mean these guys here. So let's go time warp. And in my mind, you see the problem. It's slipping through the ground. And in my mind, in this passing pose, it should be also firmly on the ground, because that is simply the way that humans walk. Let's get rid of this little guy and select our right leg controller, and under foot controls, this is actually this heel lift, so maybe 10 or so. So I'm simply refining and using the sense of movement. So the goal of this exercise is not really to create a perfect walk cycle, and actually in this contact pose, this root should be 0, because that is our default value. So maybe I accidentally forgot to keyframe that, and it's basically all about refining the motion. So observe this left foot. Let's say in this passing pose, it's not really natural in my mind. This left foot, let's select it here, should be oriented downward. Okay, I hope you understand what I mean. So something like maybe -10 or so. Let's go with -10, it's a round number. Let's keyframe that and see how that works. So it would extend naturally. So I think that makes sense to you. Maybe even more in that passing position, maybe even 30 or so. Let's try it. And of course, you can spend a lot of time on experimenting. Something like this. And this looks pretty good to me, at least this version when I'm recording. So it really makes sense. Now let's add some arm movement just to show you that it will immediately give more life to this character. So let's go to the beginning of the animation, and just as we said in earlier lessons, if the right leg is forward, then the left arm should be forward also. So let's use maybe 20, and we will add a keyframe. So this is position X, like this. And of course, if we go to next contact pose, the hand has to be in completely opposite direction, because the left leg is forward now. So let's move that by 40, because that is the double of the initial movement. You can even use lower or higher. This is where you use your artistic sense, but I'm really trying to keep this as simple as possible. So we have a movement for our left arm, let's also do the same for our right arm. So in this case, since the right leg is forward, the right arm should be backwards. So let's go with 20 also, keyframe that. Let's go to our contact pose at the end and do completely the opposite. So 40 and keyframe that. And here is the result. Now, this is the point to which I'm willing to record and lead you. Everything beyond this point can get really, really complex, but not in a term of me making something different. Rather, the amount of things to be aware of, and that is simply too difficult while recording. Now, you can clearly see that you can utilize these poses, these initial poses, to your advantage. Now, I created just a basic rudimentary stride. Now, if I would want to continue with this, I would simply have to copy the contact pose. So this contact pose and all the keys should be copied here. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. And now I would have to build recoil, passing and high point for this stride. That would give me a complete walk cycle. So you can already see that this would take serious effort. I would have to keyframe the rotation, keyframe the hip movement, and keyframe all that intricate motion in a human body, which is far beyond the scope of this lesson. But I really hope I managed to give you enough information to create your own walk cycles. So, for example, in this passing position, this root controller, this pelvis, the weight should be shifted forward a little bit. So the ability to deconstruct that motion can help you a lot. Now be patient, because walk cycles demand effort and patience. Now, with that being said, we conclude this training volume, and I really hope you enjoyed this one. And once again, I'm inviting you all to join c4dcafe.com, which is the largest Cine4D community, where you can ask questions, meet nice people, and find resources, free tutorials, and generally find everything relevant to Cine4D. What you can also find are topics about Vertex pusher trainings, and you can leave your impressions there, suggestions for future bonus lessons, or simply ask anything related to trainings on those topics. Once again, I want to thank you all for the purchase and for playing it fair, and see you in the next volume or project training.